Angle Angle Podcast, take 8. It only feels like 800. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. I have a wonderful guest for this latest episode of my podcast who has a new book out about a subject that has been a part of the American sports scene and really American pop culture probably since about 1972. That's how long America has known Pete Rose. Most athletes usually enjoy a little bit of fame, and then it goes away, they're replaced by somebody else, and then their generation remembers them forever. But the younger generation knows nothing about them. There are limited exceptions. Michael Jordan's one of them. Pete Rose is another one, for different reasons, obviously. But Pete has been around for that long. Faced the Cincinnati Reds and one of the best baseball teams ever assembled in the 70s. Went on to become baseball's all-time hit king in the 80s. And then a complete and utter fall from grace when he was banned by Major League Baseball for gambling. I was born in Cincinnati, and I was a huge Pete Rose fan. Now, when I was a kid, the Pete Rose that I saw and remember was the older guy at the end who was chasing a record and didn't know what else to do with his life. But this is how much of a Pete Rose fan I was. I have the action figure still. See if I can, you all can see that. This is the action figure that Kenner, I think it was Kenner Toys, used to make for baseball players. I still have a few of them left, but I have the Pete Rose one along with some other bits of memorabilia. Pete's been around a long time, and obviously the controversy surrounding him has made him relevant way beyond his career, and it's made him a lot of money. Whatever you think of the guy, his story is fascinating, and Keith O Brien, a best-selling author, decided to take a dive down this rabbit hole and has written a phenomenal book about it. Even if you don't like baseball, even if you think Pete Rose is kind of a scumbag, which he is, the book is a must-read. Please welcome my guest, Mr. Keith O Brien.
On a scale of 1 to 10, Keith, how good are you taking compliments?
Well, I'm Irish, so we don't know how to take compliments.
I can relate to this. So, you know Hal McCoy, right?
Of course.
So Hal McCoy, for listeners, viewers, Hal McCoy is an institution in southwestern Ohio. He's from Dayton, Ohio, and he's covered the Reds forever. You quote him in your book, and I follow him on Facebook, and he mentioned your book, and he said, I've read all the Pete Rose books, and this is the best one. And for Hal McCoy to say that says a lot. It is a tremendous work. You did such a great job on it. Yeah. And, there's a million questions I've got. I can only get to so many. But when I'm reading it and I'm reading these details about a hero to me as a kid, I'm thinking, was this fun? Like, was this a labor of love, or was it just a swim through mud?
No, it wasn't the latter. As I indicated in the author's note, I think, I began to think of Pete as, Icarus in red stirrup socks and cleats. He was going to fly, this guy, and inevitably he was going to fall. And, there is sort of the natural narrative tragedy in that. I think there are, obviously some upsetting things in the book, some disappointing scenes in the book, certainly some things to be sad about in the end, because I think, as my reporting shows, it didn't need to go like this.
No.
It didn't need to go like this. But writing it was actually very gratifying in a way that I didn't expect. I'm from Cincinnati, and like I was there for so many key points of this story as a kid, as an adolescent, as a teenager. And I'm not in this book. There's no me, there's no I to it. I'm not part of the story. But because Pete's story was sort of the wallpaper of anyone's life in Cincinnati in the 1970s and 80s. It was for me a little bit like going back and visiting the house you grew up in. And so in that way, it was personal.
Pete's been an American sports conscious since the 60s. Here we are in 2024. And I obviously not everything has been said and written about him, but this guy's been around for a long, long time. And you've heard a million stories even before you decided to take up this as a book. In your research, did you come across anything, Keith, that made you admire him or even think less of him than you already did either way?
Certainly in both ways.
Yeah.
Part of the book, as you know, is his unraveling off the field. And part of his unraveling is gambling, but part of it is also just the other choices he's making in his life, choices he's making in particular in regards to women, I wasn't going to shy away from any of that. And so, I did track down, people who Pete had relationships with. So at times that was hard. If you pass through Pete's orbit in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in any meaningful way, it left a mark on you. That's one thing I learned for sure in the interviews I did. And if you were hurt by him, and a lot of people were hurt, you still carry that hurt. They still carry that hurt. And so, sometimes I would get off the phone with somebody who'd been hurt by Pete, and I would feel that in the way that, journalists feel the interview that they just conducted. And I would, feel that pain of whoever I was talking to. But then other times I would be interviewing someone who loved Pete for whatever reason and loved him with the same kind of passion that which the people who hated him had their passion. And so then you get off the phone and think, wow, like Bernie Carbo, the former player for the Reds and the Boston Red Sox, loves Pete Rose. Like he loves him. And so you're like, so interesting. And so I've said that, this is the first book that I've ever done where people have strong opinions either way. They feel it in their core. And it's also the first book I've ever done where the people who are in the room together sometimes don't see the story the same way. Sometimes are working from a different set of facts that they believe is 100% true. And so part of my job was, setting aside the feelings, the feelings that were imparted to me, and trying to find what was the closest version of the truth here.
I had a friend of mine who worked in the Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum for a long time. And this is before I became a voting member. Not that that means anything, but, I have a vote now. So I have some thoughts on this subject, as does everybody who's ever been a baseball fan. And this guy told me, he said, Pete Rose eventually will be in the Hall of Fame, but he'll be dead. And I'm like, and I really hate that. I really hate these guys who go in posthumously. Like, if you're going to do it while they can enjoy it and they know what's going on. And I don't see it happening anymore. But Keith, do you think Pete ought to be in the Hall of Fame?
I want to say I agree with you on the posthumous election. I felt terrible when Buck O'Neill, a great statesman of baseball, who I was fortunate enough to interview a few times, I'm sure you were too, was inducted after he died. I mean, just devastating, honestly. My book here is not about making an argument for Pete Rose. It's not about making an argument against Pete Rose. I didn't write it because of the whole Hall of Fame question. And really, in a book that's 320 some pages long, I only really address it in the final sort of section in a page or two. So it's not why I wrote the book. But of course, I have feelings about it, like everybody who's ever, cared about a baseball game. And my prevailing thought is that I think we've just lost perspective here in general. We like to put our athletes, our famous ones especially, on pedestals that they may or may not deserve or ask for. We like to ascribe to them moral values that they may or may not share. And in the end of the day, they are, men who just happen to be really good at playing a little kid's game. And we frankly just don't know that much about them personally. And, look at the situation unfolding right now in Los Angeles with Shohei Ohtani, his interpreter, and the alleged illegal bookie and alleged payments of millions of dollars to pay gambling debts. Who would have ever thought that would be surrounding Shohei Ohtani on opening day 2024? No one would have thought it. So my personal feeling is, in a blanket way, I think players should be honored or not, enshrined or not, based on what they did on the field. And then if what they did off the field is so egregious, their mistakes so wrong, I think we should put them on the plaque, those mistakes on the plaque at Cooperstown. That's my take. And by the way, I first heard that theory from Terry Francona, the longtime player and manager, probably a future Hall of Famer, in my opinion, as a manager. That was Francona's take. And he said, listen, I know what these guys have done. And by these guys, he meant not just Rose, but the steroid guys. He said, I know what happened. He's like, I was there for some of it. But his position was the one I just described. And I had never heard that before until I talked to Terry. What do you think?
And Terry kind of said what a friend of mine said, which was, you can't tell the story of Major League Baseball without Pete Rose. And the Hall of Fame and Museum is to tell the story of whatever it is, whether it's World War II, Pro Football Hall of Fame, whatever. And you can't tell the story of Major League Baseball without Pete Rose. I'm sorry. Even if what he did was the most egregious sin in the game, which it was, he still belongs there. He's got more hits than anybody else. I was reading your book, and I forgot about some of his achievements, that they were staggering, that he was doing it at 35, 36, and 37 years old, stuff that Tom Brady's doing it now. People weren't doing that back then. And he was so good. I think he should go in as a player. And the more I read about your book, I knew a lot of, I kind of knew some of it. Like, one of my favorite, when I got to meet Hal McCoy at spring training there in someplace in Florida, Plant City, whatever it was, I remember him telling the story. Pete Rose would want $1,000 from you to cross the street. Right. And that's what Pete was, right? And the more I read your book, it just sounded like, God, he used anybody who was in his way. And we will excuse anything for fame. But he was a great player. And I don't think, if I have a vote and he's on that ballot, I'm voting for Pete Rose. And I'm with Tito on this 100%. You mentioned Ohtani, and now because, we're in the headline business and all this other stuff, and the immediate thing is to say, whoa, Pete Rose, Shohei Ohtani. Keith, are we jumping the gun on this? Are there comparisons to be made between the two?
We're jumping the gun on the details for sure.
Got it.
The initial allegations that Pete Rose faced in 1989 are not the initial allegations that Shohei is facing now. From the jump in 1989, the rumor that Major League Baseball heard and initially began to investigate quietly, secretly, was that Pete Rose was betting on baseball and he was betting on the Reds. That's not the initial reports out of Los Angeles, as we all know. So that is completely different. But there are some similarities here. It was men in Pete's inner circle who were placing his bets with bookies. It wasn't Pete. He on maybe only a few occasions ever interacted directly with the bookie himself. It was Mike Bertolini and Tommy Giosa and Paul Jansen and close pals, trusted people who were placing the bets. Two, these men I just mentioned start to pop up onto the radar screen of federal investigators, the FBI in Cincinnati. In the same way there's a federal investigation happening in Southern California, there was a federal investigation happening in Cincinnati. It was not about Pete Rose. It was about other guys, including a few I just mentioned. It was only when the federal investigators began to close in on Tommy Giosa and Paul Jansen and others that Pete Rose's sins became more glaringly apparent. And then the last thing I would say is, just as it was the press in recent days who have pushed this story into the news, it was Sports Illustrated back in 1989 that pushed the Pete Rose story into the news and really held Major League Baseball's feet to the fire. I did multiple interviews with the people in the front office of Major League Baseball in 1989, and all of them agreed that they had to take action, they had to do something, because they knew that the press, i.e. Sports Illustrated, was digging in, and they couldn't sit around while Sports Illustrated did its work. They had to do their work too. And again, we don't know what we don't know about the situation in Los Angeles right now. But all of those things are similar. And I think what we're about to find out, again, whether there's any connection to Shohei or not, and whether there's any baseball gambling or not, we're about to find out what kind of appetite the public, the fans, and baseball itself has for a lengthy investigation into its most famous player, because the Pete Rose investigation didn't take a day and it didn't take a week.
For a long time.
It consumed the entire season.
Yeah, I remember that.
It destroyed the 89 season.
It did. When that was happening, and I remember my dad worked in Cincinnati, him telling me, and I'm a freshman in high school and I'm naive, Keith, and he's telling me, he said, son, they've got him. He knew people. He worked for the Kroger Company. The Kroger Company was a significant sponsor of the Cincinnati Reds. And I remember him telling me, he's like, he knew, and he didn't want to tell me, but I believe Pete. I'm like, he didn't do it. He didn't do it. He didn't do it. And now that I'm older, I'm like, how did I not see that? I got to tell you, when I'm listening to Shohei read his press release or his press statement, whatever you want to call it, I'm like, he didn't do it. He didn't do it. Do you think even now at 50, I'm as dumb as I was then when I was 14 or 15 years old?
That feeling, that evolution of feeling that you describe as a kid is certainly one I felt too. I think it's one that a lot of Cincinnatians felt.
Mm-hmm.
When the news broke in February '89 that Giamatti was investigating Rose potentially for gambling, and then when it was announced that they were hiring John Dowd to be the special counsel. Those two men, Giamatti and Dowd, were like villains in not
I hated them,
but in many baseball towns.
Yep.
They were like villains. And I felt, again, as a teenager who's a raging baseball fan, when the news broke in those early months, I felt the same way as you did. There's just no way. There's no way. It's almost like what in my book, there's a scene when Pete is called in for the very first meeting, the secret meeting, and they ask him point blank, "Are you betting on baseball?" And Faye Vincent's recollection of his answer is, "No, I wouldn't be that stupid." And it was convincing. They believed him, Mac. They believed him that day. That's how convincing he was. And Cincinnatians believed him. Fans believed him. I, as a 16-year-old, believed him at that time. But I remember when the Dowd report dropped in its entirety through a court order near the end of June. So we're now 4 months in. Pete's still saying, of course, that he hasn't done anything. And then suddenly the Dowd report is released. Just the summary of it, 225 pages with some depositions and volumes. And even as a 16-year-old who was a fan of baseball and a fan of the Reds, I could look at that report objectively and say, well, there's just no way that this isn't true. There's no way that he's.
So you believe the report? Like I remember when that came out, I'm like, well, I believe P. Rose. I believe my hero. But at that time, Keith, you as a fan and as a developing young person, you're like, oh no, he's guilty.
I did feel that way about the report. And again, those personal feelings aren't part of my book at
No, I
all.
know.
But what is that report and how it was compiled and how Dowd put it together. And I have to say, John Dowd, we just mentioned a minute ago, was considered a villain in Cincinnati in particular in 1989. And he's taken a lot of criticism over the years. But when you go back and you look at what he did and what his small team of investigators did under pressure with everyone watching, in a matter of 8 to 10 weeks, he builds a dossier of evidence that is an incredibly accurate first draft of history. It is a remarkable piece of work, frankly, in my opinion.
The title of the book is Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. It's a great title. Why do you think the 70s and 80s were the last glory days of baseball, or is that just a good subhead?
No, I mean, hopefully, the subtext comes through in the book itself, that these were the glory days. I mean, the crowds are enormous. The league is growing. The television audiences are massive. You have some of the most epic games of baseball history in this window of time. Remember, Pete Rose played professional baseball for 30 seasons.
That's staggering.
1960 as a minor leaguer, 1989, he's banned forever, 30 seasons. And it's not just that the game was popular then, it is rapidly changing. And I don't mean to suggest with the subtitle that I have some kind of idealistic nostalgia for the past, about baseball's purity. It's the opposite, actually. Baseball was decidedly impure. It was unpolished. It was raw. I mean, these guys in the 60s and 70s all had to work off-season jobs just to make ends meet. Nobody had a guaranteed contract for the next year, not even the stars. Everybody's playing for their next year's contract. Everybody's playing for their next year's salary. And they do and say things in this era that you could just simply never get away with today. You could never say or do. And in the time that Pete is there, all of this starts to change. Free agency comes in, which I think was a good thing and is right for the players. But it distances the players from the fans. By the late 1970s, fans are complaining because players are making $1 million a year. And the owners are making even more than that. And then just weeks before the secret meeting in New York in February 1989, that first meeting where they discussed Pete's gambling, Major League Baseball signs its very first $1 billion television contract. And Peter Ueberroth, the outgoing commissioner, is so proud of it. He holds a press conference at the Statler Hilton Hotel in New York and it reminds everyone that's billion with a B. And, so baseball has become more corporate. It has become more polished. There is fewer and fewer places in this sport for colorful characters. And there is maybe no place in this sport for shady characters with misdeeds in the shadows. And, Pete Rose is blissfully unaware of all these things. He's still behaving like he always has. He's doing what he wants to do, and he's going to go down. And I do think his banishment in 89 is a fault line. You can make an argument, I think, that everything before 1989 is sort of the age of the heroes.
I agree with you.
Everything after 89 is like the age of the cheaters. We're always wondering, how did they do that?
We don't trust them.
Yep. Yeah, we don't know.
That's phenomenal. I agree with you. I do think media changed, exposure changed, what we know about these guys off the field changed, and we learned how flawed they really are. In your book that you write, that I could not believe when I read this, that you talked to him quite a bit when you were reporting. I'm like, there's no way he talked to him. And I was just stunned that he talked to you for as much as he did. But eventually you write that he did quit returning your calls. Keith, in the time that he was talking to you, did you get enough? Like, were you able to cover everything in those phone calls? Or were there still lots and lots of questions that you needed to have him answered, but he just didn't call you back?
So, 27 hours of interviews is a ton of time, as you know.
Yeah.
But this is an epic life that he's lived. A controversial, epic, fascinating, complex life. And, we did get a chance to cover, I would say, everything.
Right.
But, when you're doing reporting, as you know, you finish an interview with me, and then you go interview 5 more people about me, let's just say, and then you have some follow-up questions based on the stories they told. So there were times where I simply wasn't able to, go back to Pete with questions about a scene or a moment or something that Dave Parker said or whatever. But when I went back and went to my tapes and went to my transcripts of the hours I had with Rose, I realized that I probably had pushed him as far as he could go. And I don't know that if I'd even had 3 more hours with him, if he would have gone further into the darkness than I was already able to push him. And that was something that I was really just trying to do the whole time. And when I say darkness, I don't mean it in a nefarious way. We all have our personal darknesses, our regrets, our sadness, our the moments we carry on our backs because we can't shake them. We all have that. And my goal with Pete was to go there because he's been carrying a lot for a long time, and he pretends like it's not a burden, but it absolutely it is. It has completely changed his life, and so that's where I was always trying to go with him to take it in those directions if possible.
I heard on the Dan Patrick show, Dan was talking to a longtime baseball announcer. It might have been Michael Kay. I'm not sure who it was, but they were talking about Pete and specifically, Pete's got an expensive lifestyle, right, Keith? And their point was the best thing that happened to Pete financially was being banned from baseball and having this controversy follow him for decades because it made him relevant. And by making him relevant, it made every autograph a little bit more expensive. It made appearances. It made him interesting because if he had gone in just as the hit king, then he's Mike Schmidt. Not that there's anything wrong with that, or Tony Perez or any of these great players, but he's not Pete Rose, this divisive, colorful figure that was worth more that way than just another baseball Hall of Famer. Knowing what you know about him and his finances, which obviously he made some tough choices, divorces and whatnot, do you think it was a worthy trade?
I can tell you that Pete doesn't think it was. I agree with everything you just said. I don't think he would have near the crowds at his signing tables if he was just Pete Rose, the hit king.
Mm-hmm.
It's because people gravitate to him because he's Pete Rose, the hit king, who's been banished to the hinterlands of his sport. It's that is the complete draw. And so I agree with everything you said and what Michael Kay and Dan Patrick discussed. Pete, of course, has his own version. He believes that he may have stayed in baseball for another 25 years as a manager, and if he did, he thinks he could have made, $3 million a year through, contracts and sponsorships and whatnot. Again, I'm not advocating for that argument, but in Pete's mind, he thinks he lost something. And I think more importantly than money, and I know that's unusual to say about Pete Rose, because it's always the most important thing. I do think that Pete not being able to just sit in the dugout before a game, that Pete not being able to go down to spring training and be in the batting cage with the young prospects from the Phillies or the Reds, I think that hurt him. he loved being at the ballpark, and that is in the book. Some guys didn't love baseball. I know it's a crazy thing to say.
No, they get sick of it because it's great money and it's what they knew what to do.
Yeah, it's what they do, but they love fishing or they love whatever. They're much happier somewhere else, and they can't wait to retire. And that was not Pete Rose. He wanted to play baseball until he couldn't anymore, and it was taken away.
I'll ask 2 questions and then let you go. The easy thing to do when reading your book or knowing about Pete Rose, Keith, is to say, well, the guy's a dirtbag. He's a piece of trash. He's white trash. I had friends from Cincinnati. My sister-in-law said it. She's like, oh, the guy was trash. The guy was white trash. Whatever cheap, easy, slur you want to say about the guy. Was he?
He has definitely made some decisions in his life that can only be described as low class. His lies hurt lots of people. And there were many other mistakes. But I think this is not just a very compelling human story. I think it's also a very instructive human story. I have 2 teenage boys, and a few years ago we taught them a word that I feel like is at the core of many mistakes that people make in life, and that word is hubris. And this is a story of hubris and the cost of hubris and the wreckage that creates, and it still is fundamentally, a very American story. I mean, Pete Rose, for better or for worse, he is us.
Last thing I'll ask you, I watched part of the Last Dance documentary because I had nowhere to go. It really wasn't my thing because it wasn't a documentary as much as it was a commercial for Michael Jordan, because he had to approve everything. Everything had to go through him. And there was only one exchange in that whole 8-hour saga that I thought was legitimate, where Michael talked about what he did and basically how he treated people. And if you look at it as an older person, you can see the regret. Like, he treated people like garbage, and he knew it. Like, he ran over people in his quest to whatever. And when I saw the Pete Rose apology to Charlie Gibson on ABC News, and I looked at him, I bought it. And I still go back and forth. This subject is better than anybody. Keith, do you think Pete Rose is sincerely contrite for what he did?
I think Pete Rose is sincerely contrite for what he did, but I don't think he knows how to go to the depths of that apology and that feeling that people want. And I'm not going to blame the media here. We all love it when someone goes on Oprah or 60 Minutes or your show and breaks down and cries and mea culpa, and cry and show the world that it hurts you. We all love that. And undoubtedly, if Pete had done something like that and really meant it, it would have done wonders for him. I think he simply can't do it. And he doesn't know how to do it. He doesn't know how to be vulnerable. It's not how he is wired. And it's not just something we want, in our media or on 60 Minutes. We want it from the people we cheer for. We want it from the people we like. We want it from our loved ones and family. When you apologize, you should feel it. And so I do feel like Pete is sincerely contrite. I also know for a fact that he believes he apologized for this a long time ago.
Keith, thank you so much for your time. The book is Charlie Hustle. It is outstanding. You can find it now. Congratulations on a tremendous work. It's phenomenal. I wish you all the success with it. Congratulations. Thank you so much for your time here today.
Thank you, Mac.
All right. Take care. Thanks, Keith.
All right, man. See ya.
Thank you.